In this presentation, I will reflect on the role of public space in China using the case of Kean University's campus in Wenzhou to illuminate the opportunities and challenges of establishing an American-style higher education model in China. In 2012, Wenzhou-Kean University was opened to students as a higher education joint venture between Kean University in New Jersey and the municipal government of the southern Chinese city of Wenzhou. Wenzhou-Kean University, or WKU as it is also known, is accredited by the Middle States Commission of Higher Education in the United States. While I do not consider myself an expert on Chinese culture, history, or language, I had the opportunity to lead WKU as its chief academic officer on the ground in China from 2014 to 2017. During those 3 years in China, I had an opportunity to observe close up higher education and life in this rapidly changing country, and to form a number of insights in how China functions. This presentation here is a slightly edited version of a presentation I gave in early 2018 to students at Columbia University's Graduate School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation. The presentation is divided into 3 loosely connected parts. Let me be very clear first that I have the greatest admiration for Chinese history, aesthetics, and culture, Chinese people's great sense for beauty, poetry, decency, family values, and personal humility. But I am also a social scientist and must therefore take a critical view on social issues. And since I am an outsider taking a critical look here at a culture different from my own, I find it necessary to clearly locate myself within a tradition of critical thought, which is also self-critical and applies a certain ethnographic distance to both self and other. So the first couple slides try to give that perspective. I then try to arrive at a critical perspective on the evolution of and contemporary character of public space in China. Finally, I'm trying to locate Wenzhou-Kean University as an institution trying to establish itself in the rapidly evolving public space of higher education in China. The second and third part of the presentation will use more photographs and become much more visual than the first section. By the way of disclaimers, I need to emphasize that while there may be some or even many individuals sharing my views, all opinions presented here are mine and in no way are to be seen as official positions at Kean University or at WKU, which I'm no longer affiliated with. Also, information presented here is all available in the public domain and not classified or privileged in any way. So I had the opportunity in my life to live in quite a few different places. And one of the big insights I've taken from that is that everything really is context. Some symbols or words that apply in one context may be completely differently understood in another context. The way people look at themselves and the world and their place in the world, their cosmology, their epistemology, really depends on a lot of things, their culture, their languages, where they're coming from, their history, and it's really important to keep that in mind when one talks about and tries to assess other cultures. And for that reason, I've always liked the Indian philosopher's Krishnamurti's insight, where he talks about truth as a pathless land that cannot be approached by any path, by any religion, by any sect. And he says truth being limitless, unconditioned, unapproachable by any path whatsoever, cannot be organized, nor should any organization be formed to lead or to coerce people along any particular path. If you first understand that, then you will see how impossible it is to organize a belief. A belief is purely an individual matter, he says, and you cannot and must not organize it. If you do, it becomes dead, crystallized. It becomes a creed, a sect, a religion to be imposed on others. And so, in my mind, truth, to the extent that we can even see it, is something that emerges in conversation, in the exchange between self and others, in trying to make efforts to understand others in a very comprehensive way, where they're coming from, how they're seeing themselves, how they see themselves in the world, etc. And it's something really that relates to the next slide, where I'm referring to the Jewish philosopher Martin Buber. So Martin Buber, the Jewish philosopher, really then puts the conversation, the opening up between the I and the thou, the self and the other, as central place where our lives and our existence as individuals begin to make sense. Our existence, as he posits, as individuals, as an I, begins only to make sense in relation to the other, and in an open conversation between the I and the thou, where both reveal each other to themselves and to the other. As he says, I and thou take their stand not merely in relation, but also in the solid give and take of talk. Here alone, then, as reality that cannot be lost, are gazing and being gazed upon, knowing and being known, loving and being loved. And so here you have this attitude of, being careful when you look at others, have them look at yourself, and establish that relationship of trust and openness and conversation between self and the other. That's an important attitude, I think, to have when one tries to explain others or to understand others. And it's something I'm mindful of as I'm continuing with this presentation. So I made the observation earlier that for social scientists as critical thinkers, it is important that we also critically examine our own position, particularly when we become presumptuous enough to comment about others. While I don't want to dwell on it too much here, I didn't want to leave this to be an empty admonition, and so I added this slide here. Suffice it to say, then, that we in the United States, but also in the West in general, are currently entangled in quite an extraordinary political dispensation. In many countries, we find sharp ideological divisions affecting domestic politics, with more or less overly nationalist, xenophobic, and often openly racist discourses demarcating and overshadowing some real social divisions and economic fault lines. A not so new discursive crudeness and lack of argumentative sophistication has been in the making for years now. So when the current president of the United States, Donald Trump, and his political allies in the Republican Party denounce what he calls fake news and characterizes the free press as deceitful, dishonest, and liars, and political rivals as socialists or criminals, one has to remember that someone like the Prime Minister of Italy, Silvio Berlusconi, already years ago was ranting against what he called communist prosecutors and judges. One has to remember that someone like the Turkish President Erdogan has in the past characterized CNN as spies. And the president of the Philippines, Duterte, declared that he, and I quote, gives a shit about human rights, unquote, pardon my French. There are, of course, many others on the political fringes who indulge in that kind of discourse. What is more important, however, when the press is characterized in these ways, is to remember that the language and terminology is taking a leave from the vocabulary of anti-Semites and fascists. Let's remember that Hitler's Minister of Propaganda in the 1930s promised to shut up the Jewish lying press, Judenpresse, as he called it. We all know the result of that history. The point being here that with regard to public discourse and public space, we in the West have indeed much to worry about before pointing a self-righteous finger of accusation at others. Before going any further, I think it is also important to try and arrive at a definition of what public space actually is or means. The way I define public space is as follows, and I'm simply reading here what is written on the slide. Public space is any space directly or indirectly accessible to a relatively broad spectrum of social groups, that is the public, for the purpose of defining, exercising, reinforcing, and reproducing, as well as, at least potentially, reinventing and questioning, or even challenging power and power relationships. In particular, state power or pertinent institutions representing state power. I also like a lot the way Michel Foucault, the French philosopher, talks about power. He's written a lot about webs of power and has made an argument that power is not only enacted upon us as citizens, but it is also something that we all actively participate in. And so power is something that really goes through our bodies, which then raises the question, are our bodies also public space, perhaps? And I don't presume to answer that question here. And so I like what he has said in this quotation here. He says, when he talks about society and truth, he says, each society has its regime of truth, its general politics of truth, that is, the types of discourse which it accepts and makes function as true, the mechanisms and instances which enable one to distinguish true and false statements, the means by which each is sanctioned, the techniques and procedures accorded value in the acquisition of truth, the status of those who are charged with saying what counts as true. I think that's a beautiful summary of how we produce community and how we produce truth. However, I think it's also important to keep in mind that while every society may have its own truth, they do not have and are not entitled to create their own facts. In the next two slides, I want to give a very brief history of public space in China. Again, I'm not an expert on Chinese history, and as you saw from the previous slides, I'm bringing a particular understanding to what public space is or ought to be, a Western understanding in particular. And so I think it's important, first of all, to realize that in China, in historical China, public space is organized differently. Chinese cities in earlier times were often characterized by high walls, both to protect from intrusion from the outside, but also internally the way urban space was organized. There were walled compounds, and temple compounds were walled in. So it's very strictly organized historically, with almost no street life. That also didn't change significantly when cities became more commercialized and public markets emerged. Those markets were strictly regulated and organized by guilds. With the 1949 revolution in China, a new vision of public space emerged, which led to the construction of wider roads, open spaces, and public spaces, parks in particular, big public squares. But it has been argued that these public spheres, the way they were deployed, the way they were used, made them not really public spaces in the sense that I was trying to define it earlier, but more political spaces for big rallies by the Communist Party and the government. So in many ways, public space remained restricted. Walls, gated compounds, and fences continue to be used for factories, for housing complexes, for new buildings, of the new bureaucracies that were being created. And as a consequence, public life retreated, as one observer puts it, to a large extent to the confines of the home compound. And that in some ways is an aspect that still persists today. Only in the reform era after 1978, you'll find that new urban plazas, Western style pedestrian streets, green zones, etc., started to be built. So again, urban life has changed significantly in China in the last 50, 80 years or so. There's one account from the 1970s, a visitor in Guangzhou, the former canton, remarking that as they were going from the downtown city Guangzhou to the western side, they were encountering only 15 cars. That's a city of 2.2 million people at the time during rush hour. That's of course completely differently, a different picture nowadays in China. So again, while under Mao Zedong, these public squares in China were used in a particular way, deployed in a particular way. In the 1980s, the character of these open squares began to change together with the evolution of China's economic reforms. The squares and the parks began to serve as usable public space, especially for urban residents trying to escape, for example, the confines of their homes on hot summer nights. And then in the most recent past, it's noticeable that the mushrooming of shopping malls all over China signifies the emergence of a commercialized public experience. And one observer is arguing that this commercialization manifests itself in the following way. She says the centrality of consumption to the contemporary urban experience has resulted in the neglect of other aspects of city life in urban governance, including the role of the city as a home, a place for self and collective representation, and a public sphere where local politics are debated. That's worthwhile thinking about. Looking at public space in China and architecture, it's quite noticeable, obviously. It has been publicized. Visitors to Beijing and other big cities in China immediately notice the arrival of China on the global stage manifests itself with some often very spectacular new architecture. Buildings such as these here in Beijing, the CCTV building, the Opera building near to Tiananmen Square, and the bird's nest here in the Olympic area where the Olympic Games were held in 2000. Very spectacular modern architecture saying this is the modern China. Yeah, in this slide I have some more examples of fantastic architecture, really great modern buildings. Here are the two examples from Shanghai. The Shanghai Tower, second tallest building in the world. The Oriental Pearl Tower, also in Shanghai, Pudong. Here the skyline at night of Shanghai, very spectacular in my view. This, I believe, is the Aquatic Center, again in Beijing, the Olympic Center, and here the International Conference Center in Hangzhou. Now, apart from these really spectacular and often very beautiful buildings to look at in China, every visitor to China will have noticed a lot of construction activity, particularly in the big cities, where big high-rise buildings are going up. These are mostly residential buildings, often office-based buildings, and they are much less exciting to look at than these that we just saw in the previous slides. Here's a representation of one of these. You see them in the background there, looking very much like each other, carbon copies of each other. And it's really hard to say where this picture was taken, because it could be really in any developing large city in China. Of course, with 1.2 billion people, and many living in older constructions and older buildings, some of them are actually crumbling, people will consider themselves happy and lucky if they can afford to live in one of these new buildings. They have all the expected plumbing and heating and air conditioning, and so to be able to move into one of these is for many obvious progress. Still, in terms of the picture that they leave in a city, for a city, they are often not so beautiful to look at. Here's another such a representation. Looks like some of the developments in Queens, New York, or along the east side, lower Manhattan. Not so beautiful to look at here from the top down. Some of these buildings, the construction standards are not always up to snuff. And so here you have a whole wall, a whole side peeling away of a relatively new building. This may, of course, happen anywhere else, too, in any other country, but it happens too frequently. One hears of those things in China. Here another view of this imposing uniformity, where one really feels lost in between these buildings. Walking between these buildings, you really get a sense of your own smallness, of the smallness of your own individuality. And it has been criticized. For example, there was an interesting article in the New York Times on July 13, 2008 by Nikolai Urusov, entitled Changing Face of Beijing, a look at the new China. And he says, and I'm quoting here, China's architectural experiment brims with both promise and misery. Everything, it seems, is possible here, from utopian triumphs of the imagination to soul-sapping expressions of a disregard for individual lives. And I think really with this slide and the previous slides, that's what I was trying to bring across. And then, of course, the question arises, what happens to some of the historical districts in the big cities? Often they're torn down, they're not being preserved, they have to give way to these new either high-rise or spectacular buildings that I showed in earlier slides. So here you have an example that could be really in any big city in China. You have these historical districts. Some of them are being converted into touristic areas. Here you see in the background to this, perhaps a temple, this modern construction going up again with a crane. Another view. This view is in Macau. And so quite rightly you have a tension going on in China between this urge for modernity and the question of what should give place to this modernity, what of the traditions, what of traditional aesthetics, traditional public space. And so it expressed itself in, I believe, 2014, for example, when President Xi called for an end to weird buildings in China, arguing that art should, quote, inspire minds, warm hearts, cultivate taste, and clean up undesirable work styles, unquote, and that Chinese art should disseminate, as he says, contemporary Chinese values, embody traditional Chinese culture, and reflect Chinese people's aesthetic pursuit. In August 2016, President Xi declared traditional thought and culture to be the soul of the nation. And according to one survey, vast majority of respondents, almost 90%, believe that there is a cultural deficiency in present-day Chinese society, and about half of the respondents think that this deficiency is very serious. But compare Mr. Xi's return to traditional values with his predecessor Hu Jintao, who in early 2012 wrote that, quote, the international culture of the West is strong while we are weak, unquote. And so perhaps in coming years we'll see a new aesthetic emerge in China, which sort of reaches back into Chinese historical traditions and aesthetics, but also continues to push the frontiers of modernity. We see, for example, models for high-rise buildings that resemble the mountains in historical and contemporary paintings, Chinese paintings. I find them actually quite interesting to look at and really beautiful to look at. So maybe this is something we'll see in the future, standing next to these perhaps more Western visions of modernity. To a Westerner living in China or walking through public spaces in China, it is immediately obvious that many of them are spaces of control and closure. Not only did I cringe every time my TV screen went blank, if a report on CNN or BBC would focus on issues such as Taiwan, Tiananmen Square, Tibet, the status of Hong Kong, or the Southern China Sea controversies. But other images and views in China are also noteworthy. The picture on the top left was taken a few years ago in Wenzhou, and if you look carefully, you see a Western-looking male figure in the center, apparently stealing the purse of a young Chinese lady. There are discourses promoted by the government in China that warn against the influence of outsiders, raise suspicion that Westerners in China may be spies, even if they're married to a Chinese partner. And there are many social barriers that operate against otherness and foreigners in China. I recall, for example, the controversial example of an advertisement for a washer, or it may have been a detergent, where a black person was inserted into the washer to emerge as a Chinese or a white person afterwards. These things can be Googled and read about on the internet. So to see that image that you see here is both surprising and perhaps not so surprising. Many installations and areas in public spaces are guarded by police or military police. Yes, one obviously wouldn't want to have some drunkard walk through the beautiful flowers and the symbol for international peace in front of the National People's Congress building in Beijing, as in this picture here that I took during the 2008 Olympics. And the matter becomes a little bit funny when our young policeman has to bend himself into a pretzel to prevent this little terrorist here from doing exactly that. Another typical vista is this last picture here taken at some subway or railway station. One skill Chinese people have perfected better than any other I have seen is crowd control. That is quite possibly an inevitable aspect when trying to bring order to 1.3 billion people. In this slide, there are some representations of the commercialized public space I mentioned earlier inside some of the huge shopping malls that are going up and in some cases are closing again all over big cities in China. A typical walled-in small to medium-sized factory building on the lower left of the slide. And the ubiquitous cameras monitoring public spaces inside and outside. Something that's of course also increasingly found in the West, perhaps most significantly in Great Britain. There's a sense of smallness and therefore insignificance that is imposed on the individual by the sheer size and footprint of many old and most of the new buildings. It's important to know that Chinese architects are often paid by the square foot when building public buildings. And so they tend to build huge entrance halls, huge staircases, presumably for the money that comes with that type of construction. But the effect is that the sense one gets of personal insignificance that comes from the impressions of being a small individual in an overwhelming and big mass, but also one that is constantly being observed and controlled. This raises some important questions, I believe, for the future of China's success as a nation. So my Chinese friends have to forgive me for being so critical, but if uniformity and order are indeed dominant features of public space in China, and if, as Michel Foucault said, power is a phenomenon that actually runs through our bodies, then I think we must also ask to what extent these features of control and closure dominate our mind and imagination. To what extent does power and order in China become incarnate? To what extent does it not only inhabit us, but becomes a part of us? If your mind is one of closure and subordination, what does that say about the long-term prospects of building an economy thriving on imagination and creativity, which is the aspiration of the Chinese? The Chinese artist Ai Weiwei, has made some interesting observations of personal independence, and he brings that to a point in an article that was published in the New York Times in May 2017, the 6th of May 2017, an article entitled "How Censorship Works." So I must ask, do, as Ai Weiwei argues, good fences make good neighbors? I don't know, but I find his observation important when he talks about censorship in China. The harm of a censorship system, he says, is not just that it impoverishes intellectual life, it also fundamentally distorts the rational order in which the natural and spiritual worlds are understood. The censorship system relies on robbing a person of the self-perception that one needs in order to maintain an independent existence. It cuts off one's access to independence and happiness. In this slide, I want to change gears again a little bit, and the next slides as well, and turn our attention to Wenzhou as a space in China, as a city space, that is. Remember, this presentation is not just about public space in China in general, but also focusing on Wenzhou-Kean University as a higher education institution within that space, and trying to find and define its place within emerging higher education landscape in China. Wenzhou has sometimes been called the Venice of China, and I'll come back to that with a few pictures for your illustration a little later. And it's clearly a city, when you walk through it, when you drive through it, that's steeped between tradition and modernity. As a settlement and a city, Wenzhou goes back over 2,500 years. And it's noteworthy that it is the only city in China that was designed by the founder of the Feng Shui philosophical system, Guo Pu. Feng Shui practice discusses architecture in metaphoric terms of invisible forces that bind the universe, the earth, and humanity together. And in Western terms, we can think about this as a elaborate system of sustainable development, of environmentally friendly construction, generally of the ways how human settlement and human development relates and interfaces with nature, the universe, and the earth. Wenzhou was opened to foreign trade, especially tea, by the Chefu Agreement, sometimes called the Chefu Convention of 1876. But it's important to note that no foreign settlement was ever established there. And so if you live or visit Wenzhou as a Westerner or a non-Chinese, you will find yourself among very few in the streets that are not Chinese. The expat community there is very small and by no comparison to bigger places such as Shanghai or Hong Kong or even Beijing. It is also interesting to note that Wenzhou has been for centuries a hub of Christian missionary activity. In 2012, according to official data, the city's Christians were at least 1 million strong, which in 2010, around that time, was about 11% of the total of the city's population. In terms of its geography, Wenzhou is located in the southeast of China, in the province of Zhejiang. Here's a larger representation of that same map. You see the star to the right of this slide. In the photographs on this slide, there are some street scenes from Wenzhou. Like many Chinese cities, Wenzhou has a series of canals, but the reason it's called sometimes the Venice of China is because these canals are much more extensive than in many or most other comparable Chinese cities. So you see here a historic picture of a little boat going through one of these canals. Here's another bigger canal. This is a photograph, two photographs from one of the main shopping streets in the older part of town, the center, Wuma Street. Here's a historical picture from inside one of the churches taken during a service. And the last picture is a typical street scene from Wenzhou, but it could also be pretty much in any other Chinese mid-sized, even small town where this street scene is taken. But of course, Wenzhou is not a small or medium-sized city, although for the Chinese it actually is. For Western or North American standards, it's actually quite a big city of about 8 to 10 million population, depending on how one counts. And so there's not just these historical buildings evident there, but also a lot of modernity that's taking hold, such as here on the River Wu. Wenzhou is located on a big river. This is part of some of the buildings that are going up all along there, mostly apartment, but also office buildings. Here's another such a view. Here is a look at downtown Wenzhou with also high-rise buildings going up. This is Lovers Island in the middle of the river, a quite popular destination for visitors and Wenzhounese in the summer in particular. There's a amusement park on the island. There are also two 1,000-year-old pagodas on the west and the east side of this island. And there's also a former British consulate that was built there, I believe, in the late 19th century. Unfortunately, it's falling a little bit into disrepair. And this is another view on modern downtown of Wenzhou during a night. And here is a map of Wenzhou. You can see the river along the top of this photograph. The Lovers Island that we just looked at in the previous slide is up there in the river, and to the bottom you can see the location of Wenzhou-Kean University on the outskirts really of Wenzhou. Here's another picture, another map of Wenzhou, which gives me an opportunity to talk a little bit about the infrastructure of the city, in particular regarding to transportation. On the bottom right, you can see perhaps the international airport. It's once again on the outskirts of Wenzhou, close to the coastline actually. And perhaps not on this picture, to the top left is the train station, whereby Wenzhou is connected via high-speed trains to Shanghai and other cities on the coast and the interior of the country. The yellow dot to the lower left of the map once again locates Wenzhou-Kean University, and the dotted line you see from the top right crossing the map towards the left, middle left, is a highway that's already in existence, and the lines that you see, the black lines, are planned railways to be built to connect, for example, the airport to downtown Wenzhou. These at the moment do not exist yet, but they're being constructed. At least one of them is being constructed. Wenzhou was not really built for the amount of cars and traffic that it is experiencing now, and so it's actually quite difficult, in particular during rush hour, to get, let's say, from Wenzhou-Kean University to the city center, and it will take you easily 40, 45 or over an hour to get there, depending when you're driving. Also, you do not see on this map the many larger and smaller waterways and canals that are crisscrossing the city. So this is a map of Wenzhou-Kean University campus as it currently exists in part, as it's currently being constructed in part, and as it's currently still in planning to some extent. It's roughly the shape of a triangle that's perched between two mountain ranges. It sort of opens up to a plain on the bottom, the south side of the campus. That's also where the main entrance is currently located. At the left, on the left side, there is a new highway that has been built and maybe open already, with a tunnel that goes through the mountain, connecting the campus to downtown Wenzhou in a much faster way than it used to be able to get to downtown. Maybe now in 15-20 minutes through that tunnel, through that highway, it's possible to get from the university campus to downtown, whereas it used to take much longer, 45 minutes or more. At the top of this triangle, at the apex, this area is not quite finished yet. It's currently being constructed, I believe. It's going to be a combination of faculty housing and student residence halls. It's interesting to note that because of the many graves that you find along the hillside, many Chinese, the parents and the students, considered it to be bad feng shui. It's bad feng shui in the Chinese imagination to have these graves so close and opposite visible to the student residence halls. There was a little bit of discussion going on in the social media And there will be efforts to sort of mask with vegetation these graves in the future. The area underneath, for the most part, is in existence. There are 4 student residence halls and a dining hall, as well as towards the right side existing already faculty housing. In the center of this triangle, with at the very heart a lake that will be built there, an artificial lake. These buildings are either being constructed or in existence already. There's a School of Business there. There will be a big library building that will become very much the center of the campus. The area at the bottom of this triangle, particularly to the left side, the left corner, is for the most part in existence already. This was the very first phase of constructing the campus, with large buildings there to have to have classrooms and faculty offices, as well as administrative offices there. On the right side, the right corner of the triangle, the buildings there are for the most part not in existence and not in construction quite as yet. It's also interesting that there are some ideas about connecting the campus via the waterways that Wenzhou has to offer. And you can see that on this map towards the right lower corner of this map. You see a waterway exiting from the campus area. It's interesting also to note that this is an eminent domain project, in the sense that there used to be a village there, and that the villagers were encouraged, let's say, to leave for the benefit of constructing this new development there. There are high-rise buildings that are being built for them, with modern apartments where they can live in the future. And many of the staff on campus, they are former villagers there. I do recall a conversation that one of the faculty members had with one of the staff members, asking her where she is from. And the answer was, very interestingly, I think, "I'm from under your feet." So in terms of the history and development of Wenzhou-Kean University, it was conceived in a conversation between Kean University's president, Dr. Farahi, and now China's president, Mr. Xi Jinping, when he visited back then as the party secretary of Zhejiang province, New Jersey, and the two of them ended up in a car ride discussing higher education in China and the United States. The idea was conceived during that conversation. After Wenzhou was decided to be the location for this new university, the municipal government there earmarked a quite substantial amount of money for the construction. For the first phase, it was about $230 million for the construction of this university. Once again, these are public domain information. And the mission of the university is striving to build a humanistic, ecological, intellectual, and outreaching campus, enabling extensive interactions between the faculty and the students, and encouraging autonomous learning. Wenzhou-Kean University follows Kean University's administrative system and faculty management, as it is used in most and many American and North American universities, with a multi-layered and sophisticated appointment system that tries to attract and recruit highly talented and world-class professionals. There's also an elaborate and multi-pronged evaluation and reward scheme for faculty and their research in order to support all the professional development on campus and as well the merits and demerits for reappointment and tenure. In terms of the pedagogy and academic standards at Wenzhou-Kean University, first of all, it's important to note that China has embarked on, for several years already, on a variety of reforms of its education and higher education systems. And that's important because one must know that in China, there's many hundreds of years of tradition of top-down instruction in schools and even in universities that's still very much prevalent, as well as in terms of managing and administrative processes is often top-down organization that's dominating the way things are done. This, of course, runs against Western style of teaching and learning, where we are, as well as managing businesses, where we are encouraging bottom-up lines of communication, the creative, critical input that comes from the middle and from below runs to the top. And so the pedagogy at Wenzhou-Kean University obviously represents that Western style of teaching. Critical thinking, therefore, learning how to conduct research, becoming lifelong learners are all important messages that are being given to the Chinese students, and a new experience for them for the most part. The mission of the university is embedded in three notions of creativity, innovation, and entrepreneurialism, whereas the last one, entrepreneurialism, seems to come most natural to the mostly Chinese students that are attending the university. The more challenging part is to be found in the creativity and innovation, which is then becomes part of the curriculum as well. Things important, transferable skills such as presentation skills, particularly in the English language, which is lingua franca in international business, and intercultural communication skills are also important learning goals for the students. And so there's an interactive pedagogy that's intended to actively involve students in the learning process. They're not passive sponges waiting in the classroom to soak up all the knowledge that comes from the faculty member. The goal there being to develop students' own voice and to really educate leaders, not just followers, by fostering their intellectual curiosity, by learning to reject the default, the status quo, and by encouraging them to come up with original solutions. The juxtaposition between what Adam Grant has called in his book the déjà vu versus the déjà vu. Students, Chinese students, also have to pursue a few classes of Chinese curriculum, and the university offers a rich curricular palette of other opportunities that help to stimulate interdisciplinary curiosity and interdisciplinary learning. Events like Student Research Day, global lecture series, many field trips that students are taking near and far, the existence of an English language lab where they can hone their English skills with the help of computer-assisted hardware as well as software, and the intensive mentoring that comes from the faculty. These are all some examples of the full spectrum of learning that happens at Wenzhou-Kean University, and that will continue to grow really and expand in many different directions. The full spectrum of a typical American university, an American college that they are exposed to, and that really is a very new experience for them, a transformational experience, really and truly. With this slide, I want to change gears one more time before working my way towards the end of this presentation. In this and the next few slides, there are several pictures and graphic representations of current buildings on campus, as well as those under construction or in planning. I will not go into an analysis of the web presence of Wenzhou-Kean University. Suffice it to say that for the years that I have been familiar with this new university, I have found the web presence in need of improvement. To this very day, there are faculty listed that have left the university years ago. There is much room for the improvement of quantity and quality of content, and I will leave it at that. So here we have a picture from the main entrance area at the campus. In the background, you see the general education building where most of the current classrooms are located, faculty offices, administrative offices. In the context of China, this is a very modern building, a brand new building for sure. On the inside, it has a lot of the technological expectations that a modern university would need to fulfill. Here's another perspective of this general education building at night and illuminated. Again, this is a new modern building. It's a very large building. When you stand in front of it, when you walk through it, one gets a real impression of its size. In the context of China, it's also a very high quality building. However, when you walk through it, it also feels sometimes a little bit closed off, in the sense that there are no views that allow you to look through the building from one side to the other, from the bottom floor up to the top, from the inside outside, or from the outside in. And in that sense, it reminds me of a building that I'm showing you in the next slide. So this building is not a building on Wenzhou-Kean University campus. It is a perhaps medieval castle or a replica of a medieval castle somewhere. But the feeling of this building is similar that one gets as an individual standing in front of it. Again, it's an imposing building, it's impressive, it's perhaps even beautiful to look at, but for sure it gives the impression of trying to keep you out, and walking through it, one will probably have a sense of also being enclosed, and the eye will not have an opportunity to roam about due to the small and few windows that are there. And in that sense, it very much reminds me of the general education building and some similar buildings standing near to the general education building on campus that are part of the first phase of building on Wenzhou-Kean University campus. Here are a few more pictures taken from a similar perspective, again looking at phase 1 of Wenzhou-Kean University. Again, the area near the main entrance, here with faculty teaching, taken from some of the brochures that are being created there. Students sitting there at the entrance of the general education building, and here some of the basketball courts behind the general education building. Here's a combined work-study area for students somewhere in the general education building, typical of an American university anywhere. So this is the second phase of Wenzhou-Kean University campus. Again, you see in the background at the top of this picture the general education building and the main entrance area next to it, where several of the previous pictures were taken from. In the foreground, the new building is the new School of Business. And as is immediately obvious, I believe, this is a different kind of architecture and different kind of building that was put there. Again, one also gets a good sense now of the size of some of these buildings. This School of Business building is not as perhaps small as it seems from this drone perspective from above. But what is also obvious is that there are different access points. It's a very accessible building. There's a lot of glass windows which make it a bright building. There's an interior court. So the eye has enough opportunity to both look in from the outside as well out from the inside. And walking through it and walking around it, it's just an interesting building to look at, inviting to come in and study there. Here again is the campus map that we looked at earlier, and I just want to quickly juxtapose it to the photograph that we just looked at of the business school, so you have a good sense of where these buildings are located on campus. So here's the photograph again with the red arrow pointing to the exact location where it is on campus. Behind it in the photograph, in front of it, on the map, you'll see the general education building. Here the other red arrows identifying those locations. Again, the general education building in my mind is an enclosed structure, relatively uninviting and not very transparent or bright on the inside. The new business school, quite the opposite, quite accessible, transparent, big window spaces, bright on the inside, allowing the eye to roam around and inviting the visitors to come inside and learn there and study. Again, in these two buildings of the first phase and the second phase, I think one can see the difference of direction that's being taken now in the construction on campus, and it reflects in some of the brochures that are being produced. I have a quote here that's taken from one of these brochures. Again, these are public domain, that sort of shows how both sides are trying to bring their architectural imagination to the construction of the campus. So in this quotation it says, Wenzhou-Kean University is seeking diversity in the architectural design for the campus, providing huge space for innovative designs. Uniformity in the designs is not obligated, while a great dialogue through diversity is more welcomed to seek a path towards balance. And of course, balance is an important notion in the Feng Shui philosophy, whereas on a typical modern campus, you want to have buildings that are inviting and that are immediately sort of messaging to the outside viewer what they are for or what they might represent or what kind of activities are going on in there. Here are two more pictures from the outside of the business school. Again, with the uneven edges of the building, the bright colors. It's interesting to look at. It's inviting to look at. It's accessible. It reflects the other buildings surrounding this architecture. This is just a pretty building to work in and to enjoy learning in. Here are a few more photographs. Again, bright colors being used, the broad staircases leading up, allowing the eye to move far ahead of the body in exploring this building. The eye can also look from the bottom up or from the top down, several floors. And here on the outside of the building, these columns, and then in the background you also see the mountains surrounding the campus. So it's an open building. It's inviting to come in. Here a picture taken on the rooftop of the School of Business. Again, in the background, the mountains surrounding the campus. This will be a green area on top of the building, recreational. Students can go there and relax, read, study, hang out. Here the interior court of the School of Business, again with green and also with modern sculpture, some art integrated into the building to again represent more than just a facade, represent more than just a building to sit in, make it interesting and exciting to be part of this building and part of this structure and all the things that are going on in there. And here's some other views inside of the learning spaces and meeting spaces of the School of Business. Some of the lecture theaters, brightly lit, big staircases also on the inside of the building. Here are other perspectives of the building, some of the administrative areas with the faculty or administrative offices, bright corridors, bright offices with glass windows, not enclosed, not hidden behind closed doors, as is so often the case in many of the traditional Chinese universities. So transparency, openness, bright accessibility, those are the dominant ideas that are represented here in the construction of this building. Here are a few more pictures taken from the inside the classroom. You notice the flexible mobile furniture that allows shifting the seating arrangements differently. Here's a conference room, a lecture theater, and again, these are all in the School of Business. This is the very latest building to go up at Wenzhou-Kean University. In fact, I had to add this slide to my original presentation. It has been just there for under a year. It is the gymnastic building. And I think with the sharp edges and the round contours, it's a very interesting contrast, and it's a handsome building to look at for sure. Interestingly enough, though, it does not have a gym, I'm told. So I call this one Wenzhou-Kean University 2.0. Again, a part of the second phase that's currently under construction or in planning. This is the future library for Wenzhou-Kean University. Again, a very exciting building to look at, I believe, on several levels, interesting different layers put together. Again, an open building, bright building. In the background to the left, you can see a representation of the residential halls where students are living that are already in existence. Here, another representation from the inside of this new library, provided by one of the architectural firms working on it. You can see this open design, floors that are easily accessible through several staircases, different layers that allow students to work and get engaged with each other and perhaps with faculty, to hang out, to study, to relax, and use this building to the fullest extent it will be intended for. Here's some photographs taken from similar buildings that show the kind of open floor concepts with, again, flexible furniture that allow for different seating arrangements, group work, for students to come together, for small group learning, like in this picture, studying, hanging out. In this slide, some more pictures taken from buildings in planning or in existence, showing the open floor concepts within this library. Study spaces, quiet rooms, and group activities possible in these spaces. So these are some of the ideas that will find its way into this new library building. So this concludes the presentation. Again, this was a presentation intended to talk about both public space in China and how it is changing, as well as the American-Chinese joint venture that's manifested in Wenzhou-Kean University, a public university in New Jersey, establishing a campus in China. I don't really have a summary or conclusion to offer. There were a number of different perspectives during this presentation that were offered. Everybody can draw their own conclusions, can agree or disagree. I certainly welcome your comments if you have any, or if there are any inquiries that you have. Please feel free to email me and let me know if I should add something or if perhaps I misrepresented something. Thank you.